All right, well, welcome everyone. Laurence, can you give me a thumbs up or let me know that we're good on the screen? I want to make sure everything is up and running properly.
Everything's looking really good, Jeff.
Excellent, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. It's a little disappointing that we weren't able to provide you with live telescope feeds of the moon tonight. The moon that we would have seen tonight looks very much like what you see on this first slide, about the 10-day-old, a little past first quarter moon. We have clouds, they're spotty, they're patchy, but even if we could shoot in the holes those clouds, the sky conditions are very turbulent. They're not very good for doing, really close-up high magnification views of the moon. So we're sorry that we couldn't provide that to you tonight, but I'm hoping to provide you with a little bit of an alternative, kind of a tour of the moon, give you a basic understanding of kind of the ways in which you can look at and appreciate the moon with your eyes, but also with a pair of binoculars or even a small telescope or even a larger telescope if you happen to have access to one. So what we're going to do this evening is I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the major things that you should know about the moon in terms of how we talk about it, how we talk about the orientation of features on the moon. I'll go into showing you some of the large scale structures on the moon. We'll even watch a video that I shot through my telescope that's very high magnification, about a 4-minute video, and we'll do a flyover of the moon, and I'll narrate a little bit about what it is you're seeing, just to give you a sense of, if you have access to a telescope that can get up in magnification, what are the kinds of things that you can see if you had that opportunity. And then I'll show you some of the other kinds of structures that are available when you see the moon at different periods during the lunar cycle. But I want to start out this evening by kind of orienting you, getting you used to kind of how do we talk about the moon? What's up, what's down, what's north, what's south? And I want to begin with the really obvious part. So when we look up into the sky at night, if we didn't have the clouds up over our heads, you would see the illuminated side of the moon. This is the side of the moon that's facing the sun. So the sun in this instance would be down and to the lower right in this slide. I'm going to bring up a little pointer that I can use to kind of show you the direction that the sunlight would be coming from. The sunlight's coming from this direction, so it's illuminating this side of the moon. The other side of the moon is the shadowed or unilluminated side. And as we all know, when we look up at the moon at a particular time during the month, we might see a nice phase like this, a good lunar crescent. We might see it much fuller, or even a full moon, where it's just a big round glowing orb in the sky. And the moon has a cycle that we're going to talk about in just a little bit, where it goes through these phases on pretty much a monthly basis. But one of the really interesting things in amateur astronomy, and again with your eyes or with a pair of binoculars or a small telescope, that you want to kind of focus on when you begin to observe the moon is this thing. This is called the terminator. It's the contact between the illuminated side of the moon and the shadowed side of the moon. And it's along this line that really, really interesting things can be seen. Well, why is that? Well, if you think about it, if you were standing on the terminator at this point, at the point in time that the moon was when I took this photo, if you were standing right there, it would be like dawn here on Earth. So the sun would be very low on the horizon, just creeping up above the horizon. And you know that at dawn or at dusk, when the sun is setting, shadows are really, really long. So it's along the terminator, when you're observing the moon with binoculars or a telescope, that those shadows are really long, and all of the relief, the craters, the mountains, all of the structures on the moon stand out very, very prominently. At full moon, the sun is directly overhead, as if it were noon here on Earth, and you don't have any shadows, right? Except directly under your feet if you were standing here on Earth at noon. And that makes everything all washed out. You really can't see the evidence of the height, the ups and downs of the lunar topography. So the terminator is a very important thing, and it's actually what defines these crescent phases, these phases of the moon that we're all used to looking at in our lives when we look up at night at the moon itself. So another thing to think about is, how do you orient yourself on the moon? How do we talk about up, down, north, south, east, west? Well, much like here on the Earth, we've kind of defined cardinal directions on the moon. So there is a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere. And there's an east and a west, just like here on Earth. If you're looking at a map and you have north at the top, east is to the right, west is to the left. The interesting thing about how you can tell which side you're looking at in terms of north or southern hemisphere is that the southern part of the moon, what are called the southern highlands, are very, very rough. So even if you look at them kind of by eye, but certainly with a pair of binoculars, even binoculars you would use for birding, you can notice this very rough texture. So the southern highlands, this southern hemisphere of the moon, is very high. It's high elevation, so it's mountainous, but it's also been pummeled a long time ago by lots and lots of asteroid impacts. So there are tons of craters that have just pounded this hemisphere of the moon. And it's a very, very old surface. That bombardment happened 2.5, 3 billion years ago and left the scars in these highlands of the moon. The northern hemisphere, in contrast, is actually much smoother in appearance, and it's the one that has the structures that we're probably very familiar with, these things called seas or mare. And the seas in the moon are what make up the man in the moon or the Mickey Mouse in the moon or the rabbit in the moon, whatever it is you see when you look up. It's those dark gray patches that are actually in appearance very smooth. And it's the northern hemisphere that has most of those. So you know the northern hemisphere, the top side of the moon is smoother because it has those seas. The southern hemisphere of the moon is much more rough because it has those highlands that have just been hit by so many asteroids over time. It's very, very heavily cratered. One thing to notice when you're observing the moon, particularly with a small telescope or a larger telescope, is that along the terminator here, again, that contact point between the illuminated and the shadowed side of the moon, on the other side, in the shadowed side, you might see little bright points. And you can see that right here. I've circled 4 of them. Those bright points are mountaintops. Or that in particular, those little dots, those are mountaintops that are illuminated by this very low angle sun, essentially at dawn on the moon. This longer structure that's illuminated is actually the edge of either a mountain ridge or the edge of a crater rim. Again, illuminated by this early sunlight. If you've ever been to a mountainous area and you're on the east side of it and it's dawn, the mountains are in shadow, but the first thing to get lit up are the peaks. That's the first thing the sun hits, the tops of the mountains. That's exactly what we're seeing here. So later on in the video and in a couple other slides that I have, look for those little points of light on the other side of the terminator. And you'll know that those are high points that are getting lit up by the early morning light, essentially, on the moon. And again, it's the terminator that sweeps across the surface of the moon through the course of a month, creating the phases that we're familiar with. And it's along that boundary where there's lots of interesting stuff that you can see because those shadows are so stark. And I mentioned earlier that the moon has this cycle of phases, and this particular slide was done by an amateur astronomer named Tony Honchar. It's a really, really great slide, so I had to borrow it and give him credit. And it shows you through photographs that he took the entire lunar cycle, which is about a 29.5-day cycle. It's not quite 30 days. And you'll notice that we refer to what phase, for the most part, what part of the lunar cycle the moon is in by the day. So the cycle just repeats itself. Is it day 2, this very, very thin crescent? Is it day 10, which we're on now? So we're on a little bit over day 10, day 10.4. This is what the moon would look like if you could step outside and we didn't have any clouds. It would look like that. Full moon is day 15, and so forth. Then we start getting the waning moon when essentially we're getting sunset sweeping across the surface of the moon from our perspective. Another way to talk about the lunar cycle is how much of the moon's face that's facing us is illuminated at a particular point in time. And we're just past what's called first quarter moon, which occurs around day 8. And that's where 50% of the moon's surface that's facing us is illuminated. Day 15, full moon, as you'd expect, 100% of the moon's surface that's facing us is illuminated. And then on the other side of the cycle, day 21, third quarter moon, last quarter moon, again, 50% of the moon's surface is illuminated. In this case, it's the western side as opposed to the eastern side in the first quarter. So you'll hear amateur astronomers and others talk about what day of the lunar cycle is it, and that corresponds directly to what phase you can expect to see up in the night sky, whether you'd have a big gibbous, very bright, nearly full moon, or it'd be a slim crescent just past or just before new moon. And again, tonight we're on day 10 of the lunar cycle, and this would be the moon that we would have seen this evening if we had been able to provide you with the live video feed. So a few things that I'd like to show you, kind of other structures that you can see when you're looking at the moon. So this is what the moon would look like, the 8-day-old moon, remember days of the lunar cycle. This is what the 8-day-old moon would look like through a modest telescope. And you'll be seeing some of those kinds of instruments in the next part of this thread. We have some of the other Madison Astronomical Society members at Monona Terrace with some of their equipment set up, and they're going to show you their telescopes, and you'll be able to see instruments that you'd be able to see the moon just like this in both parts of the slide. But when you're looking at the full face of the moon, you can see those large structures like the seas, the Mohr. And you'll notice that they're different colors. This is kind of a dark gray. This actually seems almost like to have a little bit brown or yellow in it. And that actually reflects different mineralogy. The composition of the rock, the minerals in the rocks that make up these two surfaces are slightly different. And that reflects differently in the color that you see. By and large, the seas are actually basalt plains. So basaltic lava welled back up when large asteroids impacted the moon, carved out these huge basins, and they refilled with basaltic lava. Basaltic lava is the kind of stuff that's currently shooting out of the volcanoes in Hawaii, for example. The Hawaiian Islands are made of the same kind of material, basalt lava. You'll notice the Southern Highlands are very bright. See how rough it is? Remember I mentioned the Southern Highlands, very, very high, relatively speaking, in terms of the terrain. And then you have all these craters because it really took a beating about 2.5, 3 billion years ago. You'll notice big mountain ranges are visible at certain times of the lunar cycle. And we'll take a closer look at this in just a second. Large craters, mountain peaks that are isolated. And remember, look for those bright lights on the other side of the terminator. There are a couple of them. So those would be high points on the terrain of the moon, just on the other side of the terminator. So on the same night that I took this photo of the full face of the moon, the 8-day-old moon, I did a little mosaic. I took two images of the close-up of this particular portion of the moon right here. And this is what came out of that. I joined the two images into a mosaic. I stitched them together, and you can see this incredible mountain range called the Apennine Mountains. These mountains were actually thrust up into the air. They were pushed up into the air, there's not air, into space over the surface of the moon. When the asteroid that created the Mare Imbrium Basin impacted it, it actually shoved these mountains up and forming a bit of a ring around the basin. So we have these incredible Apennine Mountains. Right here in this little notch is where Apollo 15 landed. They intentionally landed in this area because it had very interesting geology, and they wanted to check that geology out. You can see there are other mountains. We have large craters that you can see. Notice this right here. See the shadow of the crater? So the sunlight is coming from this direction, and we're near the terminator, so it's a very low angle, like at dawn. And this edge of the rim of the crater is casting this shadow across the smooth floor of the crater. And all that relief that you see there, all those ups and downs, let me zoom in a little bit. Look at that. See how jagged that is? That's actually the cross section of the edge of the rim of this crater of Archimedes. So you can actually see what the ups and downs of the edge of the crater look like by defining that shadow across the floor of the crater. Another interesting thing that you can see, since I just zoomed in, you'll notice this crater, Aristillus, it's pretty deep. It also has that shadow across the floor. And then there are these central peaks in the middle of it. So just like if you drop a drop of milk into a cup of milk, it goes in, creates a crater real quick and a ring, splash of milk goes out, but then it rebounds and a little central peak comes up. Same kind of thing can happen when an asteroid slams into the moon, melts the rock as it does that. It creates a crater, cavity, and then there can be a rebound. And that rebounding material, essentially lava, melted rock, cools very rapidly in the vacuum of space, and it can create these mountain structures in the center. There's also this apron of debris. It's called a debris apron, literally around Archimedes, or Aristillus, I'm sorry. And that's where, when the asteroid impacted the crater, it spewed out a whole bunch of material directly out and over the edge of the forming crater. So this is all debris radiating out and away from Aristillus that was created when the asteroid that formed it impacted the surface. And then a little further up, we've got some of these isolated mountain peaks along the floor of the basin. These cracks here, they look like cracks. They're actually wrinkles that are caused by differential cooling of the basalt lava that filled the Imbrium basin when it was formed. So you can get fractures, so cracks, but you can also get wrinkle ridges that form as that material cooled in different ways after the asteroid that created that basin impacted it, and the basalt began to cool. So these are the kinds of things that you can see in a medium, modest, small to medium sized telescope, certainly in a larger telescope as well, on a good night when the atmosphere is very stable, and you can see beautiful, beautiful details across the face of the moon. So I'm going to show a quick video here. This is going to be a little tour along the terminator of the 8-day-old moon, if I remember. So we're starting in that very rough, very heavily cratered, mountainous southern hemisphere. This is a very famous crater called Clavius crater. Remember this one because we're going to look at it again at a different phase of the moon, and you'll see it looks a little different than that. Oh, you know what? I'm not sure I did the setting to make that happen very smooth. We'll see how this goes. There is a video setting to make it go a little bit smoother. This is a wonderful crater called Tycho. I'm going to pause it here. Tycho is about 56 miles across and 3 miles deep. It has a beautiful central peak in the middle, so you can see the shadow of the crater rim right there, but also the shadow of the central peak extending even beyond that. So Tycho is a relatively young crater. It impacted the ancient highlands here only about 100 million years ago. So when you look at it in a different phase, when it's more towards noon, where Tycho is, when the sun's more overhead, you can see that Tycho is very bright, almost white in color, as is the material that was ejected from it. And that indicates you're looking at a young crater when that occurs. So we're going to go, there's Tycho again, going to go a little bit further north. We're going north along the terminator. This is what it would have looked like if we'd been able to do the flyover for you tonight with our live telescope feeds. And some of you may be noticing how the view seems to be swimming. It's kind of shimmering. That shimmering is due to the atmosphere, due to atmospheric turbulence. This is actually really good, what we call seeing, where the atmosphere is not particularly turbulent. This was a good night to be observing the moon. As this moves over, I'm going to pause it and show you a little something else here. So on a good night, there's not much of that shimmering, and you can really make out very fine details and very small craters and things like that, small structures on the moon. On a bad night, you can barely see anything at high magnification. Everything is very out of focus. You might have moments where things get sharp and clear, but after that, it's just kind of a mess, which is what we would have had tonight, even if we hadn't had many clouds. The seeing would have been very, very bad, a lot of turbulence. And we wouldn't have been able to see very much, certainly not like this. I want to show you this particular object right here. Notice this straight line. It's actually a shadow because this is a cliff, relatively cliff. It's about a mile wide, but it's 60 miles long. So this line is very famous on the moon. It's called the straight wall, and it's a fault escarpment, where one side of that line went down relative to the other side, which went up relative to the side that went down. It's a 60-mile long fault scar, essentially, and it's about a mile wide. So it's not like a sharp drop off if you're actually there. It's more of a fairly steep slope, something that you could conceivably walk up if you were there. But if you think about it, 60 miles, right? That is a little shorter than the distance between Madison and Milwaukee. So if you put Madison right here on the edge of this little ghost crater, Milwaukee would be about right here, just to give you a sense of scale. If you're familiar with the geography of Wisconsin, that'll give you a sense of the scale of what we're looking at here.
Hey, Jeff, we
Yeah,
got a question from Robin.
sure.
You mentioned how the Tycho crater was relatively recent. She was
Yeah.
wondering, why do we see so many meteor impacts on the moon from long ago, but nothing in recorded history?
That is a really, really great question. What's interesting is we do still see impacts on the moon, just they're not that big. So there are amateur astronomers even who do video. They take video of the shadowed side of the moon, not the illuminated side that has all this interesting stuff, but the side that when we're standing looking up at it looks dark. And every once in a while, they'll catch a flash. And that flash is actually the impact and vaporization of a small meteor, not a big asteroid, but a small meteor impacting the surface of the moon. It could be the size of a grain of sand, but the grain of sand could be going 40,000 miles an hour. And that carries a lot of energy and it creates a very bright flash. If it's bigger, like the size of your fist, that can actually carve out a small crater on the order of 30 feet across, 40 feet across, because it's traveling at such great speed. So we do still have impacts on the moon, but we haven't seen any that have been really large that have carved out a crater, kind of like what we're seeing now on the order of 30 miles or 50 miles or even larger. Early in the history of the solar system, in the first couple of billion years, there was a lot of debris left over from the formation of the planets. It's all that debris that ended up smacking into the moon, smacking into our planet and all the other planets out there as we the Earth and the moon system swept through all this debris, kind of vacuuming it up. We were kind of cleaning it up by taking all these impacts. That process is still taking place today. It's just those impacts are much less frequent because all the planets in the solar system have done a pretty good job of cleaning up their immediate neighborhoods. So that's why we don't see large impacts very often anymore, but we can still have them. And that's why NASA and world agencies are trying to catalog the near Earth asteroids, the asteroids that can kind of come close to the Earth, because we want to keep an eye on them. And if there's one that we're a little worried about that might impact us, we might find ways to be able to divert that asteroid. So thankfully, we're not getting bombarded like we were, because that wouldn't be very good for us. The dinosaurs, of course, we do have evidence that the dinosaurs, the age of the dinosaurs came to an end because of a large asteroid impact on the Earth, not on the moon. So it does still happen, but it's very, very infrequent, thankfully. It would not be good news for anybody if we had impacts on that scale on a regular basis anymore.
Great
Great
answer.
question. So I want to go a little bit further north as we fly along the Terminator, checking my time, getting a little bit toward the end of the time. I want to move up here because there's some interesting things I want to show you. Notice this deep crater, again, the shadow. Notice the points of light, whoop, on the other side of the Terminator. So those are high points. Similarly, this is the edge of a crater that's illuminated. So it's a high point just on the other side of the Terminator. These are ghost craters. A ghost crater is just the rim of a crater sticking up above the basalt that filled it. So basalt flooded this crater, and all that's left is just this hint of the ring, the original ring of that crater. So one thing, when you're looking at any surface out in the outer solar system, in particular on planets that don't have atmospheres or moons that don't have atmospheres, generally speaking, the more heavily cratered a surface is, the older it is geologically. So this smooth Mare Imbrium basin, geologically speaking, is much younger than the heavily cratered southern highlands, because they receive so many more impacts and so much more bombardment. Geologically, this particular surface has been resurfaced, so that basalt welled up and made this smooth plain. There may have been a lot of stuff there before the impact that created the basin. By the way, the Imbrium Basin is enormous. It's about 750 by 750 miles. And to give you a sense of scale, I think Texas, which is where I grew up, is about 800 by 800 miles. So this impact basin, the Imbrium Basin, is the size of Texas. So it gives you a sense of the scale of some of these impactors. In the time I have left, I want to show you our friend Clavius crater. Remember the first time we saw it at the beginning of the video, it was deep in shadow. So it was right along the edge of the terminator. This was a little later in the lunar cycle, 10-day-old rather than 8-day-old moon. And Clavius is almost fully illuminated. You can just see a little bit of shadows along the eastern edge of the crater. And Clavius is about 140 miles across. Again, for scale, if you put Madison here, Chicago would be there, because Chicago is about 144 miles from us, from Madison. So that gives you a sense of the smallest craters that you can see in this photograph that I took are about a mile wide, somewhere between half a mile to a mile wide. So with a good telescope on a good night with clear, good seeing, you can resolve some very, very faint structures on the moon. It's always changing. It's always interesting. Different kinds of craters. This is Shiller, which is actually, it's elongated like this. It's 111 miles long, but only 44 miles wide. How did that happen? Well, the impactor, the asteroid that created it, came in at an angle. It didn't come in straight down. It came in at an angle and carved out a trench rather than a typical circular crater. And here you see some of these younger craters. Remember I mentioned they'd appear very bright and have rays emanating from them. So if you look at the moon with binoculars, when it's more gibbous, when it's moving toward full, and you see these very bright craters, those are the younger ones, generally impacted around 100 to 150 million years ago. Again, anytime you look up at the moon, it never ceases to amaze, because it's always changing as that terminator sweeps across the face of the moon and the shadows change, and it brings out new structures. You can see new objects and structures on the surface of the moon. So it's endlessly interesting with your eyes to just look up at night and get used to that lunar cycle, the phases of the moon, certainly with binoculars, and that can just be the binoculars you might use for birding, or small or medium telescope. You can see wonderful things. That is the end of my story about the moon. I wish we could have shown it to you live tonight, but I hope this gives you a good sense of just how interesting it is and how much there is to see if you spend a little bit of time dwelling on our nearest neighbor. Thank you.